Have you ever felt an instant, overwhelming connection with someone that felt almost magical, only to realize later it was quietly unraveling you from the inside out? When a narcissist asks an empath to make love, something far deeper than romance is set into motion, and the shift happens so fast most people don't see it coming. What begins as intense chemistry can quickly turn into emotional confusion, self-doubt, and a loss of identity that feels impossible to explain. Carl Jung warned about these unseen psychological forces, the shadow bonds that pull us toward the very wounds we haven't healed yet. In this video, we're uncovering the hidden dynamic behind this powerful connection, why it feels so addictive, and what really happens beneath the surface when two opposite energies collide. Stay with me until the end, because the final insight could completely change how you see your own relationships. And if this speaks to you, share your thoughts in the comments and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next deep conversation. There is a strange and powerful attraction that often forms between a narcissist and an empath, and to those inside it, the connection can feel almost magical, as if something rare and meaningful has finally arrived. The empath feels seen, chosen, deeply understood, while the narcissist feels energized, admired, and emotionally fed. Carl Jung might describe this dynamic as the meeting of shadow and light, where two unconscious forces recognize each other before the conscious mind does. The narcissist is often drawn to the empath's warmth, compassion, and emotional depth because it provides a kind of emotional fuel they secretly crave but cannot generate within themselves. The empath, on the other hand, is often drawn to the narcissist's confidence, charm, and intensity because it reflects qualities they may admire or wish to strengthen in themselves. At the beginning, everything feels heightened, conversations feel deeper than usual, eye contact feels electric, silence feels meaningful, and small gestures feel loaded with significance. It can feel like destiny rather than coincidence, like finally meeting someone who understands you on a level others never have. But this intensity is not necessarily a sign of genuine emotional safety. More often, it is a sign that powerful psychological needs are being activated on both sides. The empath's natural tendency to give, to understand, to soothe, and to connect becomes the perfect environment for the narcissist's need for validation, admiration, and control. What feels like chemistry is often a trauma bond forming beneath the surface, driven by unconscious patterns rather than authentic compatibility. Jung believed that we are often drawn to people who represent parts of ourselves we have not yet healed, and this is where the danger begins. The empath may see the narcissist as someone wounded who simply needs enough love to transform, while the narcissist may see the empath as someone who exists to meet their emotional needs without limits. In this early stage, the connection feels intoxicating because it moves fast. Rapid emotional closeness, intense sharing, grand statements, and a sense that the relationship is different from all others. The empath may feel honored by the level of attention and emotional disclosure, interpreting it as trust and depth, while the narcissist may use this intensity to quickly establish emotional influence. The nervous system becomes overstimulated, the heart becomes invested, and boundaries begin to blur before they have even been consciously considered. This is why it feels so powerful, because it bypasses logic and goes straight to emotional wiring that was formed long before the relationship ever began. The empath's deep desire to connect and heal meets the narcissist's deep fear of emptiness and need for supply, creating a bond that feels profound but is actually unstable. Over time, the empath may start to notice subtle shifts. The emotional intensity becomes unpredictable. The connection begins to feel draining instead of nourishing, and the warmth that once felt so genuine starts to feel conditional. But in the beginning, these red flags are easy to ignore because the bond feels too meaningful to question. The brain releases chemicals associated with attachment and excitement, reinforcing the belief that this connection must be real, must be special, must be protected. This is the psychological gravity at work, not love in its healthiest form, but a powerful created by unresolved inner patterns meeting each other at the perfect emotional frequency. The tragedy of this dynamic is that both individuals often feel like they have found something rare, yet what they have actually found is a mirror reflecting their unhealed wounds. The empath believes they have found someone who finally values their depth, while the narcissist believes they have found someone who will finally fill their inner void. Neither realizes at first that this type of bond cannot remain balanced because it is built on emotional imbalance from the start. The empath gives more, feels more, adjusts more, and carries more emotional weight, while the narcissist takes more, centers themselves more, and slowly begins to reshape the emotional environment to suit their needs. This is why the trap begins here, in the very place that felt most beautiful at first. The danger is not in the attraction itself, but in the unconscious nature of it, the way it quietly pulls two people together based on unmet needs rather than emotional health. Without awareness, the empath can become emotionally entangled before they even realize what is happening, and the narcissist can become increasingly dependent on the empath's energy without ever learning to develop their own emotional depth. What feels like a once-in-a-lifetime connection is often the nervous system recognizing a familiar pattern, not the soul recognizing true safety. What begins as emotional closeness between a narcissist and an empath often feels beautiful, meaningful, and deeply personal, yet beneath the surface a subtle shift is already taking place. For the empath, intimacy is sacred. It represents trust, openness, safety, and genuine emotional connection. When they open their heart, they do it with honesty, believing that vulnerability creates stronger bonds and deeper understanding. They share their thoughts, their fears, their past wounds, and their hopes for the future because they value emotional truth. The narcissist, however, experiences intimacy in a very different way. Rather than seeing it as a shared emotional space, they often see it as information, access, and influence. They pay close attention to what the empath reveals, not always to connect more deeply, but to learn how to shape the relationship to their advantage. At first, this difference is almost impossible to notice because the narcissist can appear incredibly attentive, emotionally engaged, and responsive. They may ask thoughtful questions, mirror the empath's emotions, and express intense interest in their inner world, which makes the empath feel seen and valued in a way that feels rare. This creates the illusion of deep connection, but over time the empath may start to feel that the emotional flow is one-sided. They are always listening, always supporting, always understanding, while their own emotional needs receive less and less attention. What once felt like closeness slowly turns into emotional enmeshment, where the boundaries between two individuals begin to blur in unhealthy ways. The empath may start to feel responsible for the narcissist's moods, believing it is their job to keep the peace, lift their spirits, or prevent emotional outbursts. If the narcissist is distant, the empath worries they have done something wrong. If the narcissist is upset, the empath feels an urgent need to fix it. This is not because the empath is weak, but because their natural compassion is being subtly redirected into emotional labor that benefits only one side. The narcissist may begin to use guilt, silence, or emotional withdrawal as tools of influence, knowing that the empath's sensitivity will push them to try harder, give more, and question themselves instead of questioning the dynamic. The empath often doesn't recognize this as control because it doesn't look like aggression. It looks like emotional complexity, like misunderstanding, like a wounded person needing patience. They believe they are nurturing something meaningful, something fragile and precious, when in reality they are being slowly trained to prioritize the narcissist's emotional comfort over their own emotional truth. Over time, the empath may begin to walk on emotional eggshells, choosing their words carefully, suppressing their feelings, and adjusting their behavior to avoid conflict or disapproval. They may notice that expressing their own needs leads to defensiveness, dismissal, or subtle punishment, so they begin to stay quiet, telling themselves they are simply being understanding, loving, or mature. This is where the loss of boundaries becomes most dangerous, because it happens gradually and invisibly. The empath doesn't wake up one day feeling controlled, they wake up feeling tired, confused, emotionally responsible, and unsure of when their own needs started to feel like too much. What makes this dynamic so powerful is that the narcissist rarely demands control directly. Instead, control emerges through emotional patterns, rewarding the empath with warmth when they comply, withdrawing when they assert themselves, and keeping the emotional atmosphere unpredictable enough that the empath stays focused on maintaining harmony. The empath begins to measure their worth through the narcissist's reactions, feeling successful when the narcissist is pleased and deeply anxious when they are not. This emotional conditioning can create a strong attachment that feels like love, but is actually rooted in fear of disconnection and desire for approval. The most painful part is that the empath often believes they are building something sacred, something rare, something worth sacrificing for. They tell themselves that all relationships require compromise, that everyone has wounds, that patience is a virtue, and that love means staying through difficulty. These beliefs, while beautiful in healthy relationships, become dangerous when they are used to justify emotional imbalance. The narcissist may reinforce this by framing the empath as the only one who truly understands, creating a sense of emotional exclusivity that makes the empath feel special while also making them feel trapped. The empath's identity can slowly become intertwined with the role they play in the narcissist's emotional world: the healer, the supporter, the emotional anchor. And when this happens, stepping back feels like betrayal rather than self-protection. This is how emotional intimacy transforms into psychological control, not through force, but through gradual shifts in emotional responsibility, subtle manipulation, and the quiet erosion of boundaries. It is a process that happens slowly enough to feel natural, yet powerfully enough to reshape the way the empath sees themselves, the relationship, and what they believe love is supposed to feel like. There is a reason this bond between the narcissist and the empath can feel so intense, so meaningful, and almost impossible to resist, and Carl Jung's concept of the shadow helps explain why. Jung believed that each of us carries unconscious parts of ourselves, emotional wounds, unmet needs, suppressed traits, and hidden desires that shape who we are attracted to, often without us realizing it. We are not just drawn to people for who they are on the surface, we are drawn to what they symbolize inside our psyche. This is where the dynamic between the narcissist and the empath becomes especially powerful. The narcissist often appears confident, charismatic, mysterious, and emotionally commanding. They may walk into a room and naturally draw attention, speak with certainty, and project an image of strength that feels captivating. To an empath, especially one who has spent much of their life doubting themselves, people-pleasing, or staying quiet to avoid conflict, this energy can feel magnetic. It can feel like meeting someone who holds qualities they admire, envy, or secretly wish they could embody more fully. The empath, on the other hand, embodies emotional depth, sensitivity, intuition, and compassion. They notice subtle emotional shifts, feel deeply, and care intensely about the inner world of others. To a narcissist, who often struggles with emotional emptiness and fragile self-worth beneath the surface, this emotional richness feels both fascinating and useful. The empath seems like someone who can understand them without judgment, validate their feelings, and provide the emotional attention they crave. On the surface, it can look like perfect balance, like two opposites completing each other, but psychologically something more complex is happening. Jung would describe this as projection, the process by which we unconsciously place parts of ourselves onto another person and then fall in love with the image we have created rather than the reality of who they are. The empath may project their hope, their desire for deep connection, and their belief in healing onto the narcissist, seeing not just who the narcissist is, but who they believe they could become with enough love. They may see potential rather than behavior, intention rather than impact, depth rather than inconsistency. The narcissist, meanwhile, may project their ideal self onto the empath, enjoying how they are seen through the empath's admiring eyes, feeling powerful, valued, and special in ways they struggle to feel on their own. This mutual projection creates a powerful emotional illusion, one that can feel spiritual, destined, and profound. Conversations feel charged with meaning, the connection feels rare, and the emotional intensity feels like proof that something extraordinary is happening. But what is actually happening is that two unconscious wounds are recognizing each other. The empath's wound may be the belief that they must earn love by giving endlessly, understanding deeply, and healing others. The narcissist's wound may be the belief that they are only valuable when they are admired, desired, and emotionally fed by someone else. When these two wounds meet, they lock together like puzzle pieces, creating a bond that feels strong but is actually built on emotional imbalance. This is why the connection often feels fated. It feels like you were meant to meet this person, like no one else has ever understood you this way, like the timing is too perfect to be random. But Jung would argue that this sense of fate is not destiny. It is the unconscious seeking familiar emotional patterns. We are drawn to what feels familiar, even if what feels familiar is rooted in pain. If the empath grew up feeling unseen, emotionally responsible for others, or valued primarily for their kindness, they may unconsciously feel at home in a dynamic where they are needed but not fully reciprocated. If the narcissist grew up with conditional love, emotional neglect, or unstable validation, they may unconsciously seek relationships where they are constantly reassured, admired, and emotionally centered. The bond feels powerful because it activates deep emotional wiring that was formed long before either person met. The nervous system responds as if something vital is happening. The emotions feel amplified, and the attachment forms quickly. This is not simply chemistry, it is psychological recognition. The danger is that when projection is driving the connection, neither person is truly seeing the other clearly. The empath is seeing the wounded child they want to save, the hidden depth they hope to awaken, the story of transformation they want to believe in. The narcissist is seeing the admiration they crave, the emotional supply they depend on, the reflection of their ideal self. Over time, reality begins to clash with the fantasy, but by then, the emotional bond can already feel too strong to question. Jung believed that healing begins when we withdraw our projections and start to see both ourselves and others more honestly. When the empath begins to recognize that the intensity of the bond is not proof of love but evidence of unhealed wounds being activated, they take the first step toward emotional freedom. The connection loses its mystical grip, and what once felt like fate begins to look like a psychological pattern waiting to be understood. One of the most unsettling aspects of the dynamic between a narcissist and an empath is not just the intensity of the connection, but the speed at which everything begins to change. At the beginning, the emotional atmosphere often feels euphoric, almost dreamlike, as if the connection has unlocked a new level of meaning and excitement in the empath's life. There is constant communication, deep emotional sharing, affection that feels validating, and a sense that something rare and extraordinary is unfolding. The empath may feel energized, inspired, and emotionally alive in a way they haven't felt in a long time. The narcissist often contributes to this intensity through charm, attention, and emotional mirroring, creating an environment where the empath feels deeply valued and emotionally chosen. But what makes this stage so dangerous is how quickly the emotional tone can shift, often without any clear explanation. The warmth can suddenly turn into distance. The affection can become inconsistent. The praise can be replaced by subtle criticism or emotional withdrawal. One moment feels filled with closeness and certainty, and the next is clouded with confusion and emotional discomfort. This rapid shift destabilizes the empath emotionally, because they are left trying to understand what changed and why. Instead of questioning the behavior of the narcissist, the empath often turns inward and begins to question themselves. They replay conversations in their mind, analyze their words, and search for mistakes they may have made. They wonder if they were too sensitive, too demanding, or too emotional, even when their needs were reasonable and their concerns were valid. This is where self-doubt begins to take root, slowly eroding the empath's trust in their own perception. The narcissist often reinforces this confusion through subtle forms of reality distortion. They may deny things they previously said, minimize the empath's feelings, or present alternative versions of events that make the empath feel uncertain about their memory. This pattern, often referred to as gaslighting, does not always happen in obvious or dramatic ways. It can be quiet, gradual, and disguised as misunderstanding, humor, or emotional complexity. The result, however, is powerful. The empath begins to feel mentally off balance, unsure of what is real, unsure of what is reasonable, and unsure of whether their emotional reactions are justified. Over time, this creates a state of emotional dependency. Because the emotional environment becomes unpredictable, the empath begins to crave the return of the earlier warmth and closeness. They may work harder to please, communicate more carefully, and suppress their own needs in an effort to restore the connection to what it once felt like. The narcissist, consciously or unconsciously, becomes the emotional center of gravity. Their moods begin to dictate the emotional tone of the relationship. When they are warm, the empath feels relief and happiness. When they are distant, the empath feels anxiety and urgency. This emotional roller coaster can become addictive because the occasional return of affection feels like a reward after a period of emotional discomfort. The brain responds strongly to this unpredictable pattern, releasing intense emotional attachment in response to intermittent validation. The empath may begin to feel emotionally exhausted but still deeply attached, confused by why the connection that once felt so uplifting now feels draining and destabilizing. What makes this dynamic especially painful is that the empath often believes the problem lies within themselves. They may feel ashamed for struggling emotionally, embarrassed for needing reassurance, and fearful of expressing their concerns in case it pushes the narcissist further away. This internalization of blame deepens the emotional dependency because the empath becomes increasingly focused on self-correction rather than recognizing the unhealthy pattern taking place. The narcissist may further strengthen this dynamic by positioning themselves as the misunderstood one, suggesting that the empath is overreacting, too emotional, or too needy. This subtle shifting of responsibility keeps the empath emotionally off balance and seeking approval. The speed of this emotional destabilization is not random. It follows a familiar pattern seen in many emotionally manipulative dynamics: intense bonding, sudden withdrawal, confusion, self-doubt, and then brief moments of reconnection that reignite hope. Each cycle strengthens the emotional attachment while weakening the empath's sense of clarity and stability. The empath may begin to feel like they are constantly trying to return to the version of the relationship that existed at the beginning, believing that if they just try harder, communicate better, or love more deeply, the connection can be restored. But the painful truth is that this instability is often part of the structure of the dynamic itself. The emotional unpredictability serves to keep the empath engaged, emotionally invested, and psychologically tethered. Over time, the empath's intuition, which once guided them clearly, becomes clouded by emotional confusion. They may sense that something is wrong, but they struggle to trust that feeling because the emotional reality around them keeps shifting. This loss of trust in one's own inner voice is one of the most damaging effects of this dynamic. It disconnects the empath from their natural emotional wisdom and leaves them increasingly reliant on the narcissist for emotional cues and validation. What began as a beautiful emotional connection slowly transforms into an exhausting emotional maze, where clarity feels out of reach and emotional stability depends on someone else's unpredictable behavior. The most painful part of the empath journey in this dynamic is that the damage rarely arrives loudly. It happens quietly, slowly, almost invisibly, woven into everyday moments that feel harmless at first. The empath does not wake up one morning and realize they have lost themselves. Instead, it begins with small adjustments made out of care, holding back a feeling to avoid conflict, choosing the other person's comfort over their own needs, staying silent when something feels wrong because they don't want to be misunderstood. Over time, these small choices begin to stack up, and the empath slowly moves further away from their natural emotional clarity. Their needs begin to feel inconvenient, their boundaries begin to feel negotiable, and their inner voice begins to sound less trustworthy than the reactions of the person they are trying so hard to keep connected to. They may tell themselves they are being patient, mature, or compassionate, believing that real connection requires sacrifice. But the truth is that they are sacrificing themselves in ways that no healthy relationship ever asks for. They stop expressing disappointment because it leads to tension. They stop asking for reassurance because they fear being seen as needy. They stop trusting their intuition because they have been subtly taught that their feelings are exaggerated or incorrect. This is how the loss of self happens, not through dramatic moments, but through silence, through self-editing, through the quiet habit of choosing peace over truth. Carl Jung warned that losing oneself in another person's shadow is one of the most dangerous psychological states a human being can enter, because when we live inside someone else's emotional world, we lose access to our own. The empath may begin to feel disconnected from who they used to be, unsure of what they want, unsure of what they feel, unsure of where their identity ends and the relationship begins. They might feel exhausted without understanding why, emotionally numb in moments that used to bring joy, and deeply confused by how a connection that once felt so meaningful now feels so heavy. Yet even in this painful state, something important begins to stir beneath the surface. Slowly, often after deep emotional discomfort, the empath begins to see the truth they were avoiding. The connection was never sacred, never balanced, never rooted in mutual emotional health. It was symbolic of unhealed patterns seeking expression, a reflection of old wounds playing out in a familiar emotional script. This realization can be heartbreaking because it shatters the fantasy, but it is also the moment where true healing begins. When the empath understands that the bond was built on projection, emotional imbalance, and unmet needs, they begin to reclaim their power. They start to recognize their own feelings as valid again. They begin to see boundaries not as selfish, but as necessary. They slowly reconnect with their intuition, their voice, and their emotional truth. They may begin to say no without guilt, express their needs without apology, and walk away from emotional environments that feel unsafe, even if doing so feels unfamiliar at first. This process is not instant, but it is transformative. With each act of self-respect, the empath rebuilds the parts of themselves that were lost. Self-worth begins to return, not because someone else validates it, but because it is recognized internally. Emotional clarity strengthens, not because the relationship improves, but because the empath finally chooses to honor their own reality. What once felt like weakness becomes wisdom. What once felt like pain becomes understanding. And through this journey, the empath does not simply recover, they evolve. They emerge more aware, more grounded, more emotionally resilient than before, carrying with them a deeper understanding of their patterns, their boundaries, and their worth. The loss of self may have happened in silence, but the return to self is powerful, conscious, and deeply transformative. The awakening for the empath does not arrive gently. It often arrives through emotional exhaustion, heartbreak, or a quiet moment of clarity that can no longer be ignored. There comes a point when the confusion becomes too heavy, when the constant self-doubt feels unbearable, and when the emotional imbalance of the connection can no longer be justified. This moment of awareness is painful because it forces the empath to confront a truth they once resisted. The connection they fought so hard to preserve was not the deep, sacred bond they believed it to be. Instead, it was a reflection of unhealed emotional patterns playing out in real time, a dynamic rooted more in attachment wounds than in mutual emotional safety. Realizing this can feel like the collapse of a dream, because the empath must grieve not only the relationship itself, but also the future they imagined and the version of the person they believed they were connecting with. Yet within this pain lies the beginning of true liberation. Once the empath begins to see the dynamic clearly, the emotional fog starts to lift. Patterns that once felt confusing begin to make sense. The emotional highs and lows are no longer mysterious, they are recognized as part of a predictable cycle. The narcissist behavior no longer feels personal, it feels patterned. And most importantly, the empath begins to understand that their suffering was not a result of being too sensitive, too emotional, or too much, but rather a result of staying in a dynamic that required them to abandon themselves. This shift in perception is powerful because it moves the empath from self-blame to self-awareness. With awareness comes choice. Instead of reacting emotionally to every shift in the narcissist's behavior, the empath begins to pause, observe, and reflect. They start to notice when their boundaries are being crossed. They begin to feel the difference between genuine connection and emotional manipulation. Slowly, they begin to rebuild the parts of themselves that were once diminished. Boundaries become clearer and firmer, not as walls of anger, but as expressions of self-respect. Saying no becomes possible without overwhelming guilt. Expressing needs becomes an act of honesty rather than a source of fear. Walking away from emotional chaos becomes an act of courage rather than abandonment. Self-worth begins to return, not because someone else finally sees their value, but because they begin to see it themselves. They reconnect with their intuition, trusting their inner voice again after so long of doubting it. They begin to honor their emotional experience instead of minimizing it. This inner shift changes everything. The empath is no longer trying to save, fix, or emotionally manage another person. They are focused on their own healing and growth. They begin to invest their energy into relationships that feel safe, reciprocal, and emotionally grounded. They begin to choose peace over intensity, clarity over confusion, and authenticity over approval. What once felt like weakness becomes recognized as emotional intelligence. What once felt like heartbreak becomes understood as a powerful lesson. Through this awakening, the empath does not become colder or less compassionate, they become wiser with their compassion. They learn that empathy without boundaries leads to self-destruction, but empathy with self-respect leads to emotional strength. The experience, though painful, becomes a turning point rather than a life sentence. The empath emerges from the dynamic not broken, but transformed, carrying a deeper understanding of their own emotional patterns, a stronger sense of identity, and a renewed commitment to honoring their own emotional truth.